They didn't chain my hands. They didn't lock me in a room. They didn't raise their voices or threaten me. They didn't need to. Because inside the palace, control doesn't look like force. It looks like guidance. It sounds like concern. And it feels like love. Until you realize how much of yourself you've lost. I grew up believing my life was a privilege. That every restriction placed on me existed for my protection. That every decision made on my behalf was wisdom I wasn't yet old enough to understand. That belief stayed with me for years. Until one day I looked at my life and realized there was nothing in it that I had chosen freely. From the moment I was born, my future was already written, not in ink, in expectation. Before I learned what I wanted, I was taught what was required. Before I understood who I was told who I represented. My name carried weight long before my voice did. Inside the palace, childhood is not about discovery. It is about preparation. Preparation to be watched. Preparation to be measured. Preparation to be molded into something acceptable. I didn't grow up asking, what do I want? I grew up asking, what will reflect well? That question followed me everywhere. People imagine palace life as freedom, luxury, endless choice. The truth is very different. Luxury exists, comfort exists, freedom does not. Because freedom requires mistakes. And mistakes are dangerous when your life is symbolic. Every move I made was observed, every interaction evaluated, every emotion recorded, even if silently, not because they hated me, but because they feared unpredictability, and unpredictability is the enemy of power. I was taught early that silence is safety. The less you reveal, the less can be used against you. The calmer you appear, the more trustworthy you seem. The more you obey, the more you are rewarded. So I learned to restrain myself. I learned how to smile without emotion, how to speak without saying anything real, how to carry responsibility without expressing its weight. People praised my discipline. They never asked what it cost me. Control inside the palace is subtle. It doesn't tell you no directly. It redirects you. You are told, this is not the right time. This is not appropriate. This is not how it's done. Your desires are not denied. They are postponed until they disappear. And eventually you stop asking. I didn't notice the control at first, because when you grow up inside it, it feels normal. Decisions about my education were made for me. My schedule planned months in advance. My relationships quietly evaluated. I was always informed, rarely consulted. At first, I trusted that. I believed they knew better, but control has a way of expanding. What begins as structure becomes limitation. What begins as protection becomes restriction. I noticed how my interests were redirected, how my opinions were softened, how my questions were met with discomfort. Curiosity, I learned, was acceptable as long as it didn't challenge tradition. Inside the palace, you are never alone, and yet you are deeply isolated, because privacy is a privilege you don't earn. It is one you surrender. There are always eyes, always ears. You learn to guard your thoughts before they reach your mouth, and over time, that guard becomes permanent. The hardest part wasn't what they controlled. It was how invisible the control was. There were no orders, no ultimatums, just expectations, unspoken, unquestionable. And when expectations are tied to love, disobedience feels like betrayal. I began to realize that my life was less about who I was and more about what I symbolized. I wasn't encouraged to explore identity. I was encouraged to preserve continuity. Stability mattered more than authenticity. Image mattered more than emotion. And slowly, I began to disappear behind the role I played. There were moments when I felt something inside me push back, a desire to speak freely, to choose differently, to exist beyond protocol. But each time I reminded myself of duty, duty to family, duty to legacy, duty to the people who watched my every move, and so I stayed quiet. Control is most effective when it convinces you that compliance is maturity. I was told I was strong for enduring, wise for remaining calm, responsible for not reacting. No one asked if I was fulfilled. Fulfillment was never the goal. Even emotions had rules. Anger had to be controlled. Joy had to be measured. Love had to be strategic. Nothing spontaneous survives scrutiny. And when you are trained to regulate everything, you eventually forget how to feel naturally. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. A decision about my life made without my input. A path chosen because it looked right. A moment where I felt more like an asset than a person. Each fragment alone was manageable. Together, they were suffocating. I began to question things quietly. Why was choice seen as a threat? Why was individuality treated like instability? Why was control confused with care? But questions are dangerous inside systems built on certainty. So I kept them to myself. The palace teaches you how to endure pressure, but not how to release it. You carry it in your posture, in your silence, in the distance between who you are and who you're allowed to be. And when pressure has nowhere to go, it turns inward. There were days I felt grateful for opportunity, for privilege, for protection. And then there were days I felt trapped, conflicted, ashamed for wanting more than I was given. That internal conflict became my quiet companion. Control doesn't always feel like oppression. Sometimes it feels like safety. But safety without choice is just another form of confinement. I remember realizing that even my future was not truly mine. Roles were discussed, paths outlined, expectations reinforced. My voice was welcome, as long as it aligned. Alignment became the condition for belonging. What hurt most was understanding that love inside the palace was structured. It existed within boundaries, within rules. You were valued, but not unconditionally. The moment you stepped outside expectation, concern replaced support. I wasn't rebelling. I wasn't defying anyone. I simply wanted to exist fully. And that, I learned, was the most threatening thing of all. There came a point when I stopped trying to explain myself, because explaining assumes someone is listening. Instead, I observed. I watched how control shaped behavior, how silence was rewarded, how compliance was mistaken for loyalty. And I understood that this system did not know how to handle authenticity. I realized then that my life had been carefully curated, not for my happiness, but for stability. And stability often requires sacrifice. The sacrifice was me. People often ask why I remained calm for so long. The answer is simple. When control is familiar, freedom feels frightening. Because freedom requires responsibility for your own choices. And I had never been allowed to practice that. Breaking free did not mean leaving the palace. It meant reclaiming my inner life. It meant allowing myself to think without permission, to feel without justification, to want without guilt. That was the real rebellion. I stopped measuring my worth by approval, stopped shrinking to fit expectations, and slowly I began to feel present again. The palace taught me discipline. It taught me restraint. It taught me responsibility. But it did not teach me how to live for myself. That lesson I had to learn alone. Control shaped my life, but it did not define my future. Because even inside the most structured walls, the human spirit searches for space. And when it finds it, everything changes. This is not a story of resentment. It is a story of awareness, of recognizing that control, no matter how polished, is still control. And that a life lived entirely for others eventually loses its meaning. I honor where I come from, but I refuse to disappear within it, because legacy should not require self-erasure, and loyalty should never cost you your identity. They controlled my life inside the palace, but they did not take my ability to see the truth. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is the truth I carry now, quietly, intentionally, freely,